"Hi, I'm Michael." My own father, a decorated general, ripped the epaulets from my uniform in front of the entire military command. He called me a disgrace and tried to strip me of my identity in his own home. But he ended up revealing a truth that shattered his world instead. It was the night he tried to break me, and instead he broke himself. Have you ever been so profoundly misjudged by the one person whose approval you craved the most? Before I tell you what an admiral saw on my arm that made the whole room fall into a dead, terrified silence, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens when a 4-star general realizes he's the smallest man in the room. The main conflict had been brewing for years. A quiet, simmering war fought within the polished walls of our family home in McLean, Virginia. My father, General Robert Peterson, was a man carved from granite and ambition. His world was one of order, prestige, and absolute authority, symbolized by the gleaming black Mercedes-Benz S-Class that was always parked perfectly in our driveway. Next to it, my modest Honda Civic looked like a stray that had wandered onto the property. To him, that car, my job, my entire existence, was a constant nagging disappointment. He never said he was ashamed of me. He didn't have to. He showed it in every dismissive glance, every condescending remark disguised as a joke at family dinners, and every time he introduced me to his colleagues with a tone that suggested I was a charity case. That night was supposed to be the pinnacle of his social calendar, a formal military gala hosted at our house. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, catered food, and the low hum of powerful conversations. Generals, admirals, and politicians moved through the grand rooms, their medals glinting under the crystal chandeliers. I stood near the edge of the crowd, a junior officer in a sea of titans, feeling more like a piece of the furniture than the son of the host. My father held court near the massive stone fireplace, his laughter booming, his presence so immense it seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. He was a god in his own kingdom, and I was the one flaw in his perfect creation. My mother, Susan, was his silent accomplice. She was a master of managing appearances, her smile perfectly in place as she drifted between guests, ensuring everything was flawless. But I would catch her eye across the room, and in that fleeting moment I'd see the truth, a weary plea. Her look always said the same thing. Don't make a scene, Michael. Just endure it, for me. She loved me, I think, but she was terrified of my father. Her survival strategy was to enable his tyranny, to smooth over his cruelties with a quiet word or a change of subject. She chose his comfort over my dignity every single time, and her silence was a special kind of betrayal that left its own unique scars, quieter but just as deep. The trigger was something ridiculously small. A visiting colonel was discussing a recent tactical decision in a minor overseas operation, and my father offered his grand strategic opinion. I, having been closer to that kind of fieldwork than he had been in 30 years, quietly offered a different, more practical perspective. I didn't challenge him directly. I just added a nuance to the conversation. I saw the flash of fury in his eyes before he masked it. To everyone else, it was a simple discussion. To him, it was insubordination. He saw it as me, his failure of a son, daring to contradict him in front of men he needed to impress. The temperature in our little circle dropped instantly. He let the moment hang in the air for a few seconds, a predator savoring the kill. Then his voice, which had been so jovial moments before, sliced through the party's cheerful buzz. Insubordination, he said, the word dripping with contempt. It starts with a contrary opinion and it ends with a stain on the uniform. All conversation stopped. Every eye in that massive living room turned to us. He took a step toward me, his face a mask of cold rage. You wear this uniform, but you have no idea what it means. You have no concept of honor, of legacy. My blood ran cold. This was it. He was going to do it right here in front of everyone. Then he reached out and grabbed the front of my dress uniform. The sound of the fabric ripping was sickeningly loud in the sudden absolute silence. He tore the epaulets, the symbols of my rank, right off my shoulders with a single violent tug. They fell to the polished hardwood floor with a soft, pathetic clink. You are a disgrace to this family name, he spat, his voice low and shaking with fury for all to hear. I just stood there, my uniform torn, my insides burning with a shame so hot it felt like it would melt my bones. I could feel dozens of eyes on me, Pitying, shocked, and a few, I'm sure, perversely satisfied, my father had finally publicly disowned me. I felt nothing and everything all at once. The initial wave of humiliation was so intense it was paralyzing. I saw the horror on the colonel's face, the way other high-ranking officers shuffled their feet and looked away, desperate not to be a part of this family execution. My mother stood frozen near the doorway, her hand over her mouth, her face pale with a terror that was entirely for herself and the social fallout. In that moment, watching him stand there breathing heavily like a bull who had just gored his opponent, I felt something inside me shift. The years of suppressed anger, the constant feeling of being inadequate, it didn't boil over into rage. Instead, it crystallized into something cold, hard, and incredibly calm. He expected me to shout, to cry, to run from the room in shame. It's what I would have done a year ago. But he didn't know the man I had become while he wasn't looking. He had no idea what I had been doing, where I had been, or what I was capable of. As I stood there with my uniform in tatters and his condemnation echoing in the silent room, I made a decision. I wouldn't fight him with anger. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of a scene. My response wouldn't be a scream. It would be the quiet, undeniable truth, and that truth was about to walk into the light. I stood there motionless, as the two small embroidered pieces of my identity lay on the floor between us. The silence in the room was a physical thing, a heavy blanket that smothered all sound except for the frantic thumping of my own heart. I could feel the heat rising in my face, a burning tide of shame that threatened to suffocate me. Every pair of eyes in that room felt like a physical weight, pinning me in place. It wasn't just the humiliation of being disciplined. It was the public execution of my worth by my own father. He hadn't just torn my rank from my shoulders. He had tried to rip the very man out of me, leaving an empty shell for all his esteemed colleagues to inspect. I felt hollowed out, a spectacle of failure in a room built to celebrate success. My father's chest was still heaving, not from exertion, but from the sheer force of his self-righteousness. He looked down at me, and his eyes weren't filled with the rage of a moment ago. They held something far worse, satisfaction. There was a glint of triumph in them, the look of a man who believed he had just performed a necessary brutal surgery to cut out a cancer. To him, this wasn't an act of cruelty. It was an act of correction. He saw himself as the righteous patriarch, upholding the honor of a name I had supposedly tarnished. That look, more than the torn fabric or the silent judgment of the crowd, was what truly broke something inside me. He wasn't just my judge and jury. He was my executioner, and he was proud of his work. Across the room, my mother was a statue of social terror. Her hand was still clasped over her mouth, but her eyes weren't on me. They were darting around the room, assessing the damage, calculating the social fallout. She wasn't seeing her son's pain. She was seeing a perfectly curated evening fall to pieces. I realized with a sickening certainty that she would not move, would not speak a word in my defense. Her loyalty wasn't to me, her child, but to the fragile peace she had brokered with this tyrant she called a husband. Her silence was a separate, more insidious betrayal. While my father had wielded the knife, she had held me down, whispering for me to just take it, to not make things worse. In that moment, I was an orphan in a room full of my own family. The guests, these decorated men, and their elegant wives, were a study in awkwardness. They were soldiers, strategists, men trained for conflict, yet they scattered their gazes like frightened birds. Some stared intently into their half-empty glasses of whiskey. Others suddenly found the ceiling architecture fascinating. Admiral Hayes, a man I'd always respected, had a look of profound disappointment on his face, but it was directed at the floor, not at my father. No one met my eye. No one stepped forward. They were all part of my father's world, and in his world his authority was absolute. To challenge him here in his own home was unthinkable. Their collective inaction was a verdict in itself. I was on my own. My mind flashed back to 100 smaller cuts. The time he'd joked at a Christmas dinner that my Honda Civic was the perfect car for someone with such a modest career trajectory. The way he'd introduced me to his friends as my son Michael, who's finding his way in the service, his tone dripping with a pity that was more insulting than any direct criticism. He'd been doing this my whole life, chipping away at my confidence piece by piece, ensuring I never felt like I could measure up to the colossal shadow he cast. This public spectacle wasn't an isolated incident. It was the grand finale of a lifetime of belittlement, the culmination of every dismissive glance and condescending remark. I looked down at the torn fabric on my shoulders. The threads hung loose, pathetic and frayed. That uniform was something I had earned, every stitch of it paid for with sweat and sacrifice in places he could no longer imagine. It was my own, separate from him, a testament to a path I had forged for myself despite his constant disapproval. And with one violent tug, he had tried to reclaim it, to mark it as his property, something he had the right to destroy. He wanted to remind everyone in that room that I was his creation, and therefore his to unmake. The empty space where my rank should have been felt like a physical wound, cold and exposed to the air. But as the seconds stretched into an eternity, the burning shame began to cool. The initial shock receded, and in its place something else began to form. It was a cold, hard clarity, like ice forming on a still lake. I suddenly saw the situation not as a victim, but as an observer. The cord that had bound me to him, the desperate, lifelong need for his approval, had just been violently severed. He had finally done something so unforgivable that it freed me. The pain was immense, but underneath it, there was the faintest flicker of liberation. He could no longer hurt me, because he had already done his worst. There was nothing left to fear from him. Breaking the suffocating silence, my father's voice boomed, though it was lower now, laced with a false solemnity. "Let this be a lesson to everyone here," he said, addressing the room as if he were giving a lecture at West Point. "Honor is not a birthright. It is earned through sacrifice and unwavering discipline. It must be protected at all costs." The hypocrisy was so thick I could almost taste it. He was framing his abusive outburst as a noble act, a teachable moment. He was using his power to define reality, painting himself as the hero of a story in which he was and always had been the villain. The sheer arrogance of it was breathtaking. That's when I finally lifted my head and looked him directly in the eye. And for the first time in my life, I didn't see the four-star general, the titan of the military, the god of my childhood. I saw a man, a deeply insecure, terrified man who had built a fortress of medals and authority around himself because he was terrified of being seen as anything less than perfect. His need to diminish me wasn't about my failures. It was about his fears. He didn't tear my uniform to uphold honor. He did it to reassure himself of his own power. In that instant, he shrank before my very eyes. The giant was gone, replaced by a bully standing on a stage of his own making. Slowly, deliberately, I straightened my back. It was a small movement, almost imperceptible, but it felt like shifting a mountain. I didn't try to fix the torn epaulets or hide the damage. I simply stood taller, my shoulders squared. I ran my hands down the front of my dress jacket, smoothing out the wrinkles. It wasn't an act of submission or an attempt to restore order. It was a message, sent in the silent language of defiance that every soldier in that room understood. It said, "You did your worst, and I'm still standing." A few of the guests shifted their weight, their eyes now flicking between me and my father, a new tension entering the room. They sensed that the scene wasn't over. My hands fell to my sides, my fingers uncurling from the fists I hadn't even realized I'd been making. The motion was calm, measured. I wasn't preparing to argue or to run. I was simply waiting. The burning humiliation had been replaced by a quiet, steady resolve. He had built this stage to destroy me, but he had made a critical error. He had assumed he knew who I was. He had judged me based on the son he wanted me to be, not the man I had actually become. And as I stood there under the glare of the chandeliers and the weight of 100 silent stares, I knew the truth was my only weapon. And it was time to let it see the light. My father misinterpreted my stillness. He saw it as the defeated silence of a broken boy, and it fueled his righteous arrogance. He puffed out his chest, turning slightly to address his audience, the men whose respect he valued more than his own son's heart. "You see," he announced, his voice a low theatrical rumble that filled the cavernous room. "This is what happens when discipline is neglected. The rot starts small, a lack of respect, a questioning of authority. It festers. This is not just a family matter. It is a matter of principle." He was performing, turning my humiliation into a grand lesson on military ethics. He was using my pain as a prop to elevate his own status, to paint himself as the stoic guardian of tradition, a man forced to make a hard but necessary choice. He was basking in the glow of his own cruelty, utterly convinced of his own heroism. I took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the air fill my lungs, and then let it out just as slowly. It was the first conscious action I had taken since the assault, and it grounded me. I didn't say a word. I simply lifted my gaze from the floor and locked it onto his. For the first time in my 26 years, I wasn't looking at my father. I wasn't seeing the towering figure, whose approval I had chased my entire life. I was seeing an opponent. There was no fear in my eyes, no pleading, no anger. There was just a flat, cold assessment. It was a look he had never seen from me before, and it stopped him mid-sentence. A flicker of confusion crossed his face. This wasn't part of his script. Across the room I saw Admiral Hayes narrow his eyes, his head tilting ever so slightly. He noticed the shift. He was a man who understood conflict, and he recognized that a new front had just opened in this quiet war. That's when my mother finally moved. She glided across the polished floor, her movement a frantic, desperate attempt to regain control of the narrative. Her face was a mask of strained civility, a silent plea for me to just fall in line. She reached me and her hand hovered near my arm, not in a gesture of comfort but of restraint. "Michael, please," she whispered, her voice trembling, her eyes darting toward the guests. "Not here. Let's just go upstairs." Her priority wasn't my dignity, it was damage control. She wasn't trying to save me. She was trying to save her party. Her plea was the final, quiet twist of the knife. She was asking me to swallow my own blood so as not to stain her pristine white carpet. In that moment, any lingering hope I had for her support evaporated completely. I was utterly and completely alone. I didn't even turn my head to acknowledge her. My focus remained entirely on the man who had tried to break me. The general, emboldened by my mother's attempt to intervene, took another step forward until he was towering over me, his shadow blanketing me completely. "Have you nothing to say for yourself, boy?" He snarled. His voice a low growl meant only for me, but it carried in the dead silence of the room. He wanted me to crumble. He needed me to apologize, to beg for forgiveness, to validate his actions by admitting my own worthlessness. He wanted a full surrender, a public confirmation that he was right, that he was the victor. The entire room held its breath, waiting for the final blow to land, for the sun to finally break under the weight of the father's judgment. But I didn't break. I didn't speak. Instead, I did something no one in that room could have possibly anticipated. With a calm that felt utterly alien even to myself, I reached down with my left hand and began to slowly, methodically unbutton the cuff of my right sleeve. The click of the small mother-of-pearl button coming free was a tiny, sharp sound that seemed to echo in the profound silence. It was a quiet, deliberate act of defiance that was more powerful than any shout could have ever been. It was a signal that I was no longer playing by his rules. I was not leaving. I was not apologizing. I was about to change the terms of engagement entirely. My mother gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth again, this time in genuine shock. The entire atmosphere in the room shifted. The guests, who had been trying their best to look anywhere but at me, were now completely transfixed. Their polite awkwardness was gone, replaced by a raw, undisguised curiosity. This was no longer just a painful family dispute they had to endure. This was something else entirely. It was a mystery unfolding before their eyes. The son, publicly shamed and stripped of his rank, was not retreating. He was preparing for something. I could feel their collective gaze on my hands, on the slow, precise movements of my fingers. The tension in the room became a palpable thing, a thick electric current that connected every single person in a state of shared anticipation. The spotlight my father had created to humiliate me was now mine, and I had their undivided attention. My father's face, which had been a mask of righteous authority, contorted into a scowl of pure confusion, quickly followed by a flash of renewed rage. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" he demanded, his voice rising in volume. "Are you trying to disrespect this uniform even further? Are you going to make a spectacle of yourself by taking it off?" He was completely baffled. In his world of rigid protocols and predictable responses, my quiet, deliberate action was an anomaly he couldn't process. He assumed it was another act of petulant rebellion, a childish tantrum. He saw it as a desperate attempt to have the last word, and he was already preparing to shut it down. His inability to comprehend what was happening was his greatest weakness. He was so blinded by his own narrative that he couldn't see the truth that was literally about to be uncovered. I ignored his outburst. After finishing with the right cuff, I brought my hand across my body and started on the left one. My movements remained steady, unhurried, almost surgical. There was no tremor in my fingers, no hesitation. I was completely focused on the simple mechanical task. It was a moment of supreme clarity. The noise of the room, the judgmental stares, my father's booming voice, it all faded into a distant hum. All that existed was the feeling of the starched fabric under my fingertips and the quiet click of the buttons. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Admiral Hayes take a half-step forward, his gaze no longer just curious, but sharp, analytical, and intensely focused on my hands. He wasn't just watching a family drama. He was assessing a situation. He saw something my father was completely blind to. Once both cuffs were unbuttoned, I paused for a beat. The silence was absolute now. Then I began to slowly, carefully roll up the crisp white sleeve of my right forearm. With each turn of the fabric, a new layer of tension was added to the room. A low collective murmur rippled through the guests, a sound of confusion giving way to sheer breathless anticipation. It was a quiet, intimate act made public, and its strangeness held everyone captive. My mother stood frozen a few feet away, her hand still halfway to my arm, as if she were a figure in a painting. My father opened his mouth to shout again, to order me to stop this madness. But for the first time that night, something held him back. It was the absolute unnerving calm with which I was proceeding. The power dynamic had shifted, and he could feel the ground crumbling beneath his feet, even if he didn't yet understand why. As the sleeve passed my wrist and climbed toward my elbow, a sliver of dark ink became visible against my skin. It was just a hint, a partial glimpse, but it was enough to make Admiral Hayes's eyes widen almost imperceptibly. He knew, or at least he suspected. My father saw it too, but to him it was just another mark of my rebellion. A tattoo, the kind of thing he associated with undisciplined grunts and barroom brawlers. "A tattoo?" he scoffed, his voice filled with a new kind of disgust. "You defile your body just as you defile your uniform. Is there no end to your disrespect?" He thought he had found new ammunition. He thought this was the final piece of evidence that would prove my unworthiness to everyone. He had no idea that the symbol he was mocking was not a mark of shame, but a seal of honor so profound it would shatter his entire world. The truth was almost in the light. I kept rolling up my sleeve, my movements slow and deliberate, a stark contrast to the storm of fury raging in my father's eyes. His voice, once a booming instrument of command, had become a desperate, sputtering engine of insults. "Look at this," he sneered, gesturing toward my arm for the benefit of his silent audience, the final proof of his weakness. Hiding his inadequacies behind cheap ink and a childish need to rebel. This is what a lack of true discipline looks like. A permanent stain, a mark of commonness. He was so certain of his victory, so utterly convinced that this was just another nail in the coffin of my failure. He saw a tattoo. He couldn't comprehend that he was looking at a testament. He was a general, a master strategist, but in this moment he was completely blind, fighting a war he didn't even know existed. The air in the room grew thick, heavy with an unspoken anticipation that was almost suffocating. The guests were no longer just passive observers. They were a collective entity, a single silent witness holding its breath. The polite, averted gazes were gone, replaced by wide, unblinking stares fixed on my forearm. Every clink of ice in a glass, every rustle of a silk dress had ceased. The world had shrunk to this single silent act. My father had wanted a spectacle, and he had gotten one, but the star of the show was no longer him. It was the slow, methodical reveal of a secret that hung in the air like a charged particle, ready to ignite. I could feel their collective curiosity, a palpable force that was quickly eclipsing the shame my father had tried to drape over me. They knew on a primal level that this was more than just a family squabble. As the fabric climbed higher, the symbol began to take its full shape. It wasn't a colorful piece of art or a name scrawled in cursive. It was stark, brutally simple, and etched in a deep, matte black ink that seemed to absorb the light. It was a geometric design, a fusion of a silent wolf's head and a downward-pointing dagger, the lines so precise and severe they looked like they had been carved rather than inked. It was a symbol of quiet lethality, of a world that operated in the shadows, far from the polished galas and political maneuvering my father called a career. It was a mark that was never meant to be seen in a room like this, under the soft glow of chandeliers. It belonged to the night, to the quiet places where hard men did impossible things, and it felt alien and dangerous in this pristine, ordered environment. My father's face twisted in a sneer of pure disgust. "How utterly predictable," he spat, his voice dripping with condescension. He was trying to reclaim the narrative, to frame this as just another example of my poor judgment. While real men were earning their place, you were in some back alley parlor getting marked like cattle. Is this what you're so proud of? This graffiti. You bring shame not only to the uniform, but to the very skin you were born in. He gestured dismissively at my arm, as if waving away a bad smell. He was so wrapped up in his own rigid definition of honor, medals, parades, public recognition, that he was incapable of seeing the truth. He was looking at the very embodiment of a higher, more demanding code of sacrifice, and all he could see was a blemish. But then the atmosphere shifted again. The change didn't come from me. It came from across the small circle that had formed around us. Admiral David Hayes, a man whose quiet authority often outweighed my father's bluster, took a half-step forward. His face, usually a calm and unreadable mask, had gone slack with disbelief. His eyes, which had been narrowed in curiosity, were now wide with a dawning, horrified recognition. His gaze wasn't on me. It was locked on the symbol on my arm. He wasn't seeing a tattoo. He was seeing a ghost. His lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. The other senior officers near him, men who had seen combat in every corner of the globe, began to follow his lead. A ripple of silent, stunned comprehension was spreading through the highest ranks in the room, a wave of knowledge that my father was completely oblivious to. In that moment, a strange calm washed over me. This wasn't about revenge. I felt no joy in my father's impending humiliation. There was only a profound and weary sadness. This symbol on my arm was a sacred trust, a mark of a brotherhood forged in silence and sacrifice. Revealing it here, using it as a weapon in a petty family feud, felt like a betrayal of that trust. But my father had left me no choice. He had attacked my honor, the very core of my identity, in a public forum. The rules of my hidden world were clear. We did not exist. But the rules of the world I was standing in now demanded a response. He had brought this battle to me, and I was forced to use the only weapon I had that could end it. It was a weapon I had never intended to draw, and its unveiling felt less like a victory and more like a necessary tragedy. With one final smooth motion, I rolled the sleeve up to my elbow. The symbol was now fully exposed, stark and undeniable against my skin. The silent wolf, the dagger, the entire crest of the unit unofficially known as Shadow, was on display for all to see. It was a symbol that didn't appear on any official documents, a unit that the Department of Defense would publicly deny even existed. Its members were ghosts, men who had been scrubbed from official records, who moved through the world's most dangerous places without a flag on their shoulder. It was a mark of absolute commitment, earned with blood and pain in places that never made the news. It signified a level of clearance and operational authority that made a four-star general's command look like a regional manager's office. My father, finally sensing the profound shift in the room that had nothing to do with him, turned his bewildered gaze toward the admiral. The smug satisfaction was gone from his face, replaced by a deep, furrowed confusion. He saw the look of pure, unadulterated awe on the admiral's face and couldn't process it. "What is it, David?" he demanded, his voice losing its booming confidence, shrinking to a querulous, uncertain tone. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "It's just a tattoo." "For God's sake, snap out of it." He was still trying to command the room, but his authority had evaporated. He was no longer the center of gravity. He was a confused bystander at an event he no longer understood, a king who had suddenly found himself naked in his own court. The admiral didn't answer him. He couldn't. His eyes were still locked on my arm, and his face was a mixture of shock, reverence, and something that looked a lot like fear. Not fear of me, but fear born from a sudden, terrifying recalibration of the world as he knew it. The son of his colleague, the boy he'd watched grow up, the quiet, unassuming officer everyone pitied, was something else entirely. He was something impossible. The other officers who recognized the mark were frozen in place, their expressions mirroring the admiral's. The silence in the room was no longer just tense. It was sacred. It was the silence of a congregation that had just witnessed a miracle or a sacrilege. My father looked from face to face, his confusion turning to a dawning panic as he realized he was the only one who didn't understand. I finally lifted my head and met Admiral Hayes's eyes. In that silent gaze, 1,000 words were exchanged. He saw the cost of what I was doing, the broken vow of silence. I saw his profound, unvarnished respect. He gave me a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a gesture from an admiral to a junior officer. It was a sign of deference, an acknowledgement from one warrior to another who had walked a much harder, darker path. That single silent gesture was the final blow. Before any official pronouncement was made, the verdict had been delivered. In that moment, surrounded by the titans of the military world, I had been judged by a jury of my true peers. And my father, the decorated general, the man who had tried to strip me of everything, was left standing alone, an outsider in his own home, about to have his world completely and irrevocably shattered. Admiral Hayes finally broke the dead silence. His voice wasn't loud, but it had a quality that cut through the tension like a surgeon's scalpel, clean and precise. He didn't look at me anymore. His eyes were fixed on my father. "Robert," he said, and the use of my father's first name stripped of all rank and formality was a shock in itself. "Do you have any idea what that symbol is?" The question hung in the air, simple and direct, yet it carried the weight of a final judgment. It wasn't an accusation, it was a plea for him to see, to understand the magnitude of his mistake before it was too late. The entire room seemed to lean in, waiting for an answer my father didn't have. My father, still clinging to the crumbling remnants of his authority, tried to bluff his way through. He let out a short, incredulous laugh, but it was a brittle, hollow sound. "For God's sake, David, it's a tattoo," he scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. A mark of some youthful, misguided rebellion. Are we really going to let this boy's latest cry for attention derail the entire evening? He was trying to shrink the moment, to frame me as a petulant child and the admiral as a senile old man. But his eyes kept darting from the admiral's stone-cold face to my arm and back again. The foundation of his certainty was cracking, and the fear was beginning to show through. He was a commander who had lost control of the battlefield, and he was firing blindly in every direction. The admiral didn't even flinch. He just shook his head slowly, a look of profound disappointment on his face. "That's not rebellion, Robert," he said, his voice dropping to a low, serious tone that commanded absolute attention. "That's a covenant. That is the mark of a man who has volunteered to walk through hell so that people like us can have galas in houses like this." He took a step closer to me, his gaze on the symbol so intense it felt like he was reading a sacred text. "That crest isn't given in a parlor. It's earned in blood and silence, in places that don't appear on any map. It signifies a commitment that makes our oaths look like playground promises." The room was so quiet, I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. Then, turning his full attention back to my father, the admiral delivered the killing blow. His voice was barely a whisper, yet every single person in that room heard it, as if he had shouted it from the rooftops. "That is the unit crest for a Tier 1 Special Mission Unit, the one the Pentagon won't even acknowledge, the one they call Shadow." The name itself landed in the room with a physical weight. It was a legend, a ghost story that junior officers told each other in hushed tones, a mythical entity that the men in this room, for all their power and influence, spoke of with a mixture of fear and reverence. And that ghost was now standing in my father's living room, with its mark exposed for all to see. Admiral Hayes wasn't finished. He let the name hang in the air for a moment before he drove the point home, his words now a clinical dissection of my father's world. "Their operational authority is absolute, Robert. Their clearance is above top secret. In the field, a man with that mark on his arm can requisition any asset, override any command from anyone." He paused, letting the implication land with the force of a battering ram. He then looked directly at my father, his eyes cold and clear. "That symbol. In the world that actually matters, the one of sacrifice and action, not politics and parades, it outranks you. It outranks me. It outranks every single person in this room combined. The impact of those words on my father was instantaneous and devastating. It was like watching a building being demolished in slow motion. The arrogance, the pride, the towering certainty that had defined him for his entire life just imploded. The blood drained from his face, leaving behind a waxy grey pallor. His shoulders, which had always been squared with the rigid discipline of a lifelong soldier, slumped forward as if the weight of his own uniform had suddenly become too much to bear. He staggered back a step, his hand fumbling behind him until it found the cold stone of the fireplace mantel, which he gripped like a drowning man. The 4-star general was gone. In his place was just a frail, shattered old man, staring at a truth he could not comprehend. A collective gasp, a wave of stunned, disbelieving murmurs swept through the room. It wasn't the sound of gossip or scandal. It was the sound of a fundamental law of their universe being overturned. The men who had moments ago looked at me with pity or contempt were now staring with wide-eyed, unadulterated awe. Their entire perception of me, of my father, of the very hierarchy that governed their lives had been completely rewritten in less than a minute. I was no longer Michael Peterson, the general's disappointing son. I was a ghost, a legend made flesh. I was a member of Shadow, and in their world that made me something akin to a god. I felt no joy in this. There was no sweet taste of victory, no satisfaction in his public ruin. There was only a profound, hollow ache deep in my chest. I looked at my father, this broken man clinging to the fireplace for support, and all I felt was a vast, weary sadness. He had dedicated his life to climbing a ladder, collecting stars for his shoulders and the respect of these very men. And tonight he had discovered that his own son, the one he had cast aside as worthless, had been operating on a level so far above him that he couldn't even see it. His life's ambition, his entire measure of self-worth, had just been rendered meaningless by the very person he had tried so hard to destroy. The irony was so cruel, so complete, it was almost poetic. Admiral Hayes turned his gaze back to me. The shock was gone from his eyes, replaced by something much deeper, a solemn, almost mournful respect. He knew what this revelation had cost me. He understood the sacred vow of silence I had just been forced to break. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, a gesture that was not from a superior to a subordinate, but from one warrior to another. "Officer," he said, his voice firm and clear, addressing me directly. The use of that simple, formal title, after my father had torn my rank from my shoulders, was the most profound act of restoration imaginable. It was a public and undeniable validation of the very honor my father had tried to strip away. My father finally managed to make a sound. It wasn't a roar or a command. It was a weak, broken whisper that was barely audible. "Michael?" He said my name, and it sounded like a foreign word on his tongue. It wasn't a statement. It was a question. The desperate, terrified question of a man who has just realized the stranger he has been living with for 26 years is his own son. The entire balance of power in our universe had not just shifted, it had been shattered, and he was lost in the wreckage, staring up at me from the ruins of his world. He was finally seeing me, truly seeing me for the very first time. And the sight had broken him. I didn't answer him. There was nothing left to say. The truth was out, and its work was done. Slowly, with the same deliberate calm I had used to reveal it, I began to roll my sleeve back down. The motion was methodical, final. I was putting the secret away, burying the ghost once more. I fastened the button on my cuff, the small click a definitive end to the conversation. I then straightened my back and ran a hand over my torn uniform. The frayed threads on my shoulders were no longer a mark of shame. They were a battle scar, a testament to the war that had been fought and won right here in this room, not with anger or violence, but with a quiet, devastating truth. I turned and walked away. I didn't run. I didn't storm out. I simply walked, my back straight, the torn fabric on my shoulders a silent testament to the battle that had just concluded. The sound of my polished dress shoes on the hardwood floor was the only noise in that cavernous, silent room. It was a slow, deliberate rhythm, a funeral march for the life I was leaving behind. I didn't look at my mother's stricken face or my father's broken form. I didn't acknowledge the stunned, awestruck stares of the generals and their wives as I passed. I was a ghost moving through my own wake. I walked out the heavy oak doors, down the stone steps and into the cool Virginia night. I didn't even glance at the gleaming black Mercedes. I got into my old Honda, the engine turning over with a familiar humble rumble, and drove away from that house for the last time, with no destination in mind, just away. The adrenaline that had kept me standing tall finally crashed, leaving a profound, hollow exhaustion in its wake. I drove for hours, the city lights blurring into long streaks of color through my windshield. I wasn't sad or angry anymore. I just felt empty, like I had poured out every last drop of emotion I had on that living room floor and had nothing left. My phone buzzed in the center console, and I ignored it. Then it buzzed again. Finally, at a red light, I glanced at the screen. It was a text from an unknown number. The message was short, devoid of emotion, but it was a lifeline. Your secret is safe with us. Report to my office 0800 Monday. We need to talk. D. Hayes. It wasn't a question or a suggestion. It was a quiet command. And in the chaos of my world falling apart, that simple direct order was the most comforting thing I had ever read. It was a new direction, a way forward. In the weeks that followed, I pieced together the aftermath through quiet third-hand channels. The gala had ended almost the second my car pulled out of the driveway. The guests, under the pretense of a sudden illness on the general's part, had dispersed in a state of stunned funereal silence. My father, I heard, became a recluse in his own mansion. He tendered his resignation from several prestigious boards and stopped attending the social functions that had been the lifeblood of his existence. The story of that night was never told openly, but it seeped into the foundations of the Pentagon's inner circle. It wasn't gossip. It was a legend. General Robert Peterson, the man of iron discipline, had not been defeated in battle but in his own living room, by a truth he never saw coming. His authority was gone, not stripped by a command, but evaporated by shame. My mother called me 2 weeks later. Her voice, usually so polished and controlled, was thin and hesitant. She didn't offer an apology, not a real one. She offered explanations. She spoke of a lifetime of walking on eggshells, of her fear of his temper, of her desperate attempts to keep the peace. She was trying to justify her silence, to frame her inaction as a form of survival. Then she asked me to come home to talk to him. He's not the same, Michael, she pleaded. He just sits in his study all day. I listened without interruption. When she was finished, I told her very calmly that I had received a new assignment and wouldn't be returning. There was no anger in my voice, just a quiet finality. I wished her well and ended the call. The line between us hadn't just been broken. It had been erased. The meeting with Admiral Hayes was brief and professional. His office overlooked the Potomac, the walls covered in naval history, not personal accolades. He didn't mention my father or the party. He simply slid a thin file across his polished desk. My file, the one that officially didn't exist. I've had this unsealed, he said. Your service record is exemplary. He spoke of duty, of the unique pressures faced by men in my position. Then he made an offer, a new role, a specialized liaison position working directly with Joint Special Operations Commands, based out of San Diego. It was a clean break, a purpose-built future designed to utilize my unique skills. Far from the toxic politics of D.C., it wasn't a reward, it was a recognition. I accepted without hesitation. My path was no longer a secret to be hidden, but a foundation to build upon. Before I left for California, I went back to the house one last time. I chose a Tuesday afternoon when I knew they would be out. The key still worked. The house was cold and silent, feeling more like a museum than a home. It was filled with expensive objects that held no memories for me. I went to my old room and packed the few personal things that remained into 2 cardboard boxes. It took less than 15 minutes. On my way out, I walked past his study. The door was ajar. I could see the walls lined with his awards, the photos of him shaking hands with presidents. I felt a brief, sharp pang of pity for the man who needed all of that to feel whole. I went to the kitchen, left the keys and title to the Honda on the granite countertop, and walked out of his life for good. 6 months later, I was watching the sunset over the Pacific from the small balcony of my apartment in Coronado. The air was salty. The sky was a brilliant shade of orange, and for the first time in my life, I felt a sense of peace that was entirely my own. The job was demanding, the hours long, but the work was real. It mattered. I was surrounded by men who understood the world I came from, who judged me not by my name but by my actions. I was no longer the general's son or a ghost hiding in the shadows. I was just Michael. The immense weight I had carried on my shoulders for 26 years, the desperate need for an approval I could never win, was gone. I had been broken down to my foundations that night, and I had rebuilt myself into a man my father would never know, and I was finally okay with that. Just over a year after that night, a thick envelope arrived from a DC law firm. Inside there was no personal letter, no note of apology. It was a cold legal document informing me that my father had officially retired and had established a substantial trust in my name. He had also signed over the deed to a small cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains that had belonged to my grandfather. There were no words, no explanations. It was just a transaction. I understood it immediately. It was the only way a man like him knew how to say he was sorry. He couldn't offer words of remorse, so he offered money and property instead. It was a final desperate attempt to buy a reconciliation he hadn't earned, to settle a debt that couldn't be paid with a check. I spent less than an hour with the documents. I signed the power of attorney to have the law firm sell the cabin. Then I had them liquidate the entire trust. The check, for a sum that would have changed most people's lives, was made out to the Special Operations Warrior Foundation, a charity that supports the families of fallen operators. I put it in an envelope and mailed it that same day, without a second thought. I kept nothing. Not a dollar, not a deed, not a memory. His money, his property, his legacy, it was all part of a world I no longer belonged to. My honor was not for sale. My peace had been earned, not inherited. And with that final act, I severed the last thread. I was free. If you know someone who needs to hear this message of self-confidence, please share this video with them. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about finding your own path, even when it's not what others expect. Thank you for listening. Looking back on that night, the biggest lesson I learned had nothing to do with victory or revenge. It was about the source of my own value. For 26 years, I had been searching for my reflection in my father's eyes, desperately hoping to see a son he was proud of. I was looking for his permission to feel worthy. But what I discovered in that moment of ultimate humiliation is that your worth is not something that can be granted or taken away by someone else. He could tear the rank from my shoulders, but he couldn't touch the honor that was forged inside me, in the silent, difficult places he knew nothing about. True self-worth is a fortress you build within yourself, brick by brick, with your own actions and your own integrity. No one can tear it down. I also learned what real honor looks like. My father's world was a stage, built with the props of success, the gleaming medals, the 4 stars on his collar, the powerful guests who orbited him. He believed honor was something you wore, something you displayed for the world to admire. But I learned that true honor is quiet. It's what you do when no one is watching. It's the silent sacrifices, the promises you keep to yourself, the code you live by when the lights are off. It doesn't need a parade or a public acknowledgement. The men I served with, the real heroes, they never spoke of their accomplishments. Their honor was in their actions, not their words. And that's a kind of strength that doesn't need to shout to be heard. That night forced me to confront a painful truth about family. Sometimes, the people who are supposed to be your greatest supporters end up being your heaviest anchors. My mother's silence, my father's cruelty. It was a dynamic I had been trapped in my whole life. The lesson wasn't to hate them, but to understand that you have the right to break the cycle. Walking away from that house and later from the inheritance wasn't about punishing them. It was about choosing my own path, free from the weight of their expectations and their judgment. It was about realizing that you can build your own family, a family of respect and shared values, even if it's not the one you were born into. My father's power was an illusion. He commanded a room through fear and a carefully constructed image of authority. But the moment a truth he couldn't control entered the space, his power crumbled into dust. It was hollow because it was entirely dependent on external validation. Real strength, I realized, isn't about controlling others. It's about mastering yourself. It's the quiet confidence that comes from knowing who you are, independent of anyone else's opinion. It's a foundation so deep and solid that no public shaming can ever shake it. He was a general who commanded armies, but he had no command over himself, and that made him the weakest man in the room. The final piece of my freedom came when I signed away that inheritance. Holding on to anger, resentment, or even the hope for an apology is just another way of staying chained to the person who hurt you. By giving that money away, I wasn't just performing a charitable act. I was making a statement to myself. I was declaring that I needed nothing from him to be whole, not his approval, not his validation, and certainly not his money. True liberation is when you can look back at the source of your pain and realize you no longer need anything from it. That's when you're finally truly free to move forward. So I ask you, who is the general in your life? Whose approval are you fighting for? Whose judgment do you fear? We all have someone whose opinion feels like it holds the key to our happiness. I'm here to tell you that the key is already in your pocket. You have to find your own internal source of validation, your own tattoo, that secret, undeniable truth about your worth that no one can question or take away. It's the part of you that you've earned through your own struggles and your own quiet victories. Trust in that, because it's the only foundation that will never fail you. Ultimately, your life is your story to write, and you are the only one who gets to decide what honor, success, and happiness look like. It's not about defiance for the sake of it, but about having the courage to live by your own code, even if it's a quieter, less glamorous path than the one others expect of you. Finding that path is the hardest and most important mission you'll ever have. It's a lonely road at times, but it's the only one that leads to a place of genuine peace and unshakable self-respect.